Hey everybody, this is lecture 1 of module 2, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the subject of Peter Fever's article, The Right to be Right. So, supporters of George W. Bush will say that he believes he'll be vindicated by history. If this is true, I would imagine one of the decisions he'll be admired for will be his fairly audacious decision to implement the strategy that we now commonly call the surge, and then the inarguably unexpected success of that strategy. So the story of President Bush's decision, it involves a sort of a come-from-behind narrative that I would imagine historians will enjoy writing about. And that readers were like listening to. I mean, there's the this sort of unpopular war that we're entrenched in, the quagmire, if you will. It devolved into what was seemingly an intractable insurgency, and as this happens, Bush's party loses control of both branches of the legislature. A pretty catastrophic midterm landslide, and now he's also facing the ire of retired military officers and retired generals and what is reported in the press to be a near mutiny from the senior officers who are active duty. But instead of backing down, Bush decides to put all his chips in and go in on the surge. So either way, it's a fairly interesting story that I think will be looked at quite a bit in history. However, it turns out it's judged. So a lot's been written about Bush's decision and then what happened in Iraq as a result of that. And in retrospect, it seems like there's it's become fairly conventional wisdom that the surge was a major success. Maybe if not even just from a military standpoint, at least from a political standpoint. And if you look at Fever's article, if Bush had given the military the significant autonomy that would be prescribed by the professional supremacy view, he never would have implemented the surge in the first place. And on the other hand, if he'd used a more hands-on approach, and more in keeping with the civilian supremacy view, the surge would have been pretty much impossible to actually implement. So this obviously begs the question of whether the professional and civilian supremacy views are still adequate models of civil-military relations in irregular warfare. So, if you think back to early 2007, as I mentioned, the Iraq War has been devolving pretty swiftly into what seems like an irredeemable failure. Congress has, 4 years earlier, authorized the use of force against Iraq in pretty overwhelming vote that many of them would prefer to forget or hope that everyone else forgets. And then the party changes hands. So that election, the midterm in 2006, had forced Bush to to dismiss Secretary Rumsfeld, and it made it so that the reappointment of his chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Pace, was so unlikely at that point that they didn't even bother to nominate Pace for a second term, which is not the normal way things go. So all signs seem to point to the war being unwinnable, and Bush goes ahead and ignores the conventional wisdom and implements the surge strategy, which involves sending 30,000 more troops to Iraq. Now, what's especially striking about this is that President Bush made the decision in the face of opposition, not just from his political opponents, but from at least a significant number of senior military advisors, and yet he went to he made great effort to make it appear that he was simply taking the advice of his senior military leadership. Now, President Bush overruled General Casey, who, was the commander of all forces in Iraq, as well as several other military advisors, and his later statement that his senior military advisors had all signed off on the surge conveniently omitted the fact that they had signed off on it only after being convinced the president was not going to change his mind. Then President Bush goes ahead and appoints General Petraeus, who is one of the few senior officers who truly believed that the surge might work, though even he, as he writes, was not entirely convinced, and made General Petraeus, you might term, the face of the surge. And he would deflect media questions about that strategy by referring reporters to General Petraeus. So, in addition, Bush tried to dissociate himself from the surge by, pretty significantly limiting his direct contact, irregular contact with General Petraeus, which was in stark contrast to the frequent video conferences that he had with General Casey previously. In his article, Peter Feaver concedes that in the mind of the public, the professional supremacy view is treated basically as conventional wisdom. And this is, I would argue, at least partially and probably mainly due to the fact that Americans currently hold their military in relatively high esteem relative to the way other countries hold their militaries or the way the military has been held by the American public in the past. But the other part of this is that it seems to indicate that even when the public has a preference for a certain military strategy, they do not want that strategy to be decided on the basis of political calculation. What I mean by that is, let's say, the majority of Americans are against the surge, right? They may be against it, but they don't want that decision to be made because of a political calculation. They don't want to do the surge because it's a good political strategy. They want it to be done because it's the right military strategy. At least that's what people, claim to want. There's this perception of the military as an honest broker, and that's a big part of this. People are willing to, as I was sort of talking about the delegate and trustee model in the previous module, citizens, especially Americans, will be willing to, as with the sort of trustee model, say, all right, maybe I don't like that particular policy, but I want it to be decided for the right reasons. Again, this sort of makes the professional supremacy view fit pretty well within the trusteeship model of political representation. So the perception of the military as being an honest broker is it sort of demonstrates what Patrick Dempsey has termed the paradox of prestige, and you'll read more about this in Module 3. But Dempsey writes in his book Our Army, the more members of the military build a reputation for apolitical service, the greater the political prize of the military becomes. So, as the military gains in prestige, the political backing of members of the military, either whether implicit or explicit, it becomes an advantage within the electoral political system. So that is to say, the reason that there is such an advantage of having political backing from the military is because the military is seen to be apolitical, and that's what the paradox is. Because since you can't be political, once you spend that political capital, it really is can no longer. It sort of takes away from the bank more than it's sort of worth. So you're kind of as you spend that political capital, you really don't have a whole lot more to work with, because by spending it, you devalue it. In the next segment, I'll talk a little bit more about the decision to implement the surge and how it involved the senior military leaders.